Handshake is working to create smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain for international migrant workers in order to create a safer and more fair working environment for those people. They're currently a part of the Consensus Blockchain for Social Impact Hackathon, and that's taking place right now. You can find their website at handshake.tech. That's handshake.tech. In the description of this video, I've also linked to their dev post listing so you can keep up on the progress that the team is making. All right. Well, welcome, Handshake team. I myself am not real familiar with how migrant workers live and the problems they may have, and I imagine there's a whole lot of people that don't really understand some of the problems they have. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of what Handshake is, could someone just kind of in a few sentences talk about how migrant workers, international migrant workers, live in this day and age and some of the problems they might have?
Yeah, so I'll just quickly give an overview of the landscape here. So international migrant workers are basically, individuals who leave their home country to go to another country to find work because maybe they don't have opportunities in their home country. Most of these countries are usually in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and they usually end up in places like the UAE, the Gulf, Africa, of course the United States, the UK, so on and so forth. And what happens is they go to these new kind of foreign countries and then they work and then they send all their payments or their earnings back home. Usually 100% of their earnings they send back home to their families, right? So that they can have a better life. And yeah, that's kind of basically the life of a migrant worker. It's pretty, it's kind of like traveling abroad, but primarily for work, and you don't know the language, you don't know the country, and you don't know the laws. And so sometimes the issues that come up really involve what your rights are as a worker in a foreign country. So some of the issues that they face, like I said, are they don't really necessarily have the right rights, or the labor laws don't protect them. For instance, in the Gulf, some of the labor rights might only protect people that live in the Gulf, but not those who are from foreign countries. And so that usually is sometimes not stated very clearly in the contract. Another big issue is that for especially unskilled migrant workers, they end up paying very high recruitment fees to agencies who are tasked with recruiting these people to work in these countries. So the way that supply chain kind of works is you might have a TGI Fridays, for instance, in the Gulf that is looking for a bunch of cooks or chefs or whatever. They'll go to an agency in their home country. That agency will go to another agency in the sending country, let's say in the Philippines, and say, hey, we have this job order. We have to find 10 people to work at these TGI Fridays. Can you help us find them? And so what happens is that agency in the Philippines now has to go out and find 10 people, usually in very unskilled areas, in remote areas. And then they end up paying these agencies high recruitment fees for the opportunity to get sent abroad to work, to earn money to then send back home to their family. So that's probably the biggest problem that we've come across from what we've seen, is that these migrant workers are paying these exorbitant fees just for the opportunity to work. But that's hopefully changing as international standards around migrant workers change. So I would say those are probably the most prevalent issues right now. There's of course a lot of exploitation, sex trafficking, just unsafe working conditions. These are all kind of just endemic in this whole issue. And that's also related to how the contracts are constructed for these workers, because they're not very clear sometimes in like how many hours am I supposed to work a week? Do I get paid overtime? Am I allowed to, do I get a bed for where I sleep? So a lot of these things are not very clear sometimes, and are usually the workers get taken advantage of from these employers who may not be ethical themselves.
Yeah, so you had mentioned that there's a recruitment agency, there's the end business, whether it's a TGI Fridays or whatever it is, and then there's also the migrant worker. are there even more entities in between? I mean, how many people are typically, like, how many entities does this contract usually have to deal with?
Oh yeah, there's probably many more middlemen that we don't know about that definitely are present in the supply chain. So for instance, in the Philippines, let's say this agency, like I said, was tasked with finding 10 workers for this TGI Fridays over in the Gulf. Let's say all of a sudden they get another order and they have to find 1,000 workers, right? So now this agency is scrambling to find people. And so they'll end up working with sub-agents who are not licensed, who are literally just like, they're called sponsors, and they're basically just trusted uncles and officials in these remote villages who are just like earning a commission from finding people in this remote village to bring to this agency. So this agency will literally reach out to all these sub-agents and uncles and what have you to find people that want to work. And so as you can imagine, since these sub-agents are probably not the most ethical or scrupulous, they will go, they'll charge them crazy fees. They'll, just promise the world to these workers because the workers just like, they just want to work and they don't care what it takes to get there. And of course, that's where these unethical behaviors come in. So that's kind of like a supply and demand issue. If there's too much demand, then these agencies are basically left with no choice but to go and work with these sub-agents who can, do bad things.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good segue. So how is Handshake solving some of these fundamental problems?
Yeah, so we're our main solution for the problem is actually just around the labor contracts for now and how the recruitment agencies in these sending countries or receiving countries actually create contracts for the migrant workers. The main reason we wanted to focus on the recruitment agencies is because they're kind of the main like party where all these workers are coming in, and they're the ones that are in control of getting the contract signed by the worker in a lot of cases. And so we're building a platform using the blockchain that puts that contract on the blockchain. And so all the parties that need to see it have certain permissions. So if you're the recruitment agency, if you're the employer, if you're some kind of intergovernmental association, you have certain privileges to see the contract, and this contract can never change as it goes from the sending country to the receiving country. And all the terms of the contract, of course, are laid out very clearly in terms of how many hours you work, what the employer is, who the employer is, where they're located, so on and so forth. So that's kind of step one for what Handshake is. And then step two and step three is, we might think about how we can work with the employers to get the demand letter, the job orders onto the blockchain as well. How we can deal with remittance, which is when the workers send money back home to their home country, and some other aspects of the supply chain. But the focus right now is just helping the recruitment agencies act in a more transparent and more visible way to the migrant workers and to the employers who they work with.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, that was my first question. So when it comes to smart contracts, sometimes it's difficult to pull in, outside information. So you have things like you're tracking the hours they're working. Is it more of an entirely self-contained system where they're actually logging hours inside the Handshake system, or are you trying to connect with, say, timesheet invoicing systems or anything like that?
Yeah, we're not trying to go that far yet in terms of tracking. I don't know if like anyone else on the team wants to jump in here, but feel free because I always end up talking a lot. So.
Yeah, I'm happy to just jump in quickly there. So kind of on the note of tracking. So initially, we've kind of planned to, our solution doesn't really encompass kind of tracking of the users' work hours and whatnot, the employees' work hours. But definitely that's something we have to look at down the road. And we kind of have a couple of ideas there because you have these employees that potentially aren't kind of that technologically able. They might not have a lot of technology. So we're kind of looking at ways that we can implement some kind of tracking or whatever with the technology that they do have. And so like one thing that we found is that's really common in areas like the Gulf is these workers will have like a swipe card. Like it's purely just like this basic magnetic swipe card that they can use to sign on and off for shifts. They can use it to get food and things like that. And so things like this small aspect of technology, like it's this minor thing. But I think this will enable us in the future to be able to start kind of tracking the hours and stuff, like you mentioned, yeah, down the track and really cheaply. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. Well, one thing you brought up is that these entities are not necessarily that technologically advanced. So how do you even approach them with a system like this? How do you make those connections? They obviously probably don't understand blockchain technology and smart contracts. What kind of ideas do you have for onboarding like that?
Do you guys mind if I jump in there?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. The way we have it set up right now, we are planning for the agents, the government agents and the recruitment agents and the employers to be the first point of contact. So we would actually go directly to the migrant workers for now. What we're aiming to do is take the contract that the government agency needs to approve and that the recruitment agency would issue to like the sub-agents to get to the migrant workers, and just secure that, make sure that that is verifiable, so that sort of these guys can go on a web interface, which we'll build, and they'll be able to get a Handshake account and use that to interface with their identity and sign contracts. So in blockchain speak, I guess, sign the contracts and make sure that they're verified, and then get to the other end and make sure it's the exact same contract that was agreed before that is now being presented. So at first, the migrant workers are probably going to have no interaction with the blockchain directly.
Yeah, that sounds like a really smart strategy. So where did this whole idea come from, and how did you guys get together as a team?
Yeah, so we're all doing right now the Blockchain for Social Good hackathon by consensus. It's a month long, and it's been great so far. So we all met on the Slack for the hackathon. Jordan and I met first, and then Bo and Al joined. And initially, we were just focusing on identity. We wanted to build on the idea of we wanted to build on the idea of self-sovereign identity. And then we kept talking to subject experts, and eventually found the problems that migrant workers face. And still we're like focused on the identity problem. A lot of them don't have like the ability to get passports, don't have birth certificates. But it was just a huge, huge problem. And so as we like got down on it deeper and deeper, we eventually focused in on contracts.
Okay, great. Is that the self-sovereign identity? That sounds like a really interesting problem as well. Is that something that's on Handshake's roadmap for some place down the line still?
I mean, I think, yeah, someone else can jump in too. But I think that we really do want to create a system to make sure that migrant workers have access to safe work. And I think at some point that definitely might be part of it.
Yeah, and to jump in there, there's a lot of organizations that are trying to provide not just a self-sovereign identity, but just an identity to everyone in the world. I think the one organization is ID 2020 or Millennium 2020, I forget exactly what it's called. But the whole idea is that a lot of people, especially in developing countries and remote areas, they don't even have an ID, or the ID they have with the local government is very, very loose, or it's on a piece of paper and it's not very, very official to a certain extent. And so what's really exciting about our project Handshake is that, we're not trying to give everyone an identity right off the bat, but because all these migrant workers have to go through these recruitment agencies, and they get interviewed, they get screened, they have to get their passport and visas all taken care of. What's happening is, since these migrant workers have to sign contracts with these recruitment agencies to work, we're starting to build kind of like an economic identity for these migrant workers, right? So now we know that this person, Joe Schmo from the Philippines or from Nepal, they now have this contract on the blockchain which tells us their name, how much they're getting paid, who the employer is, their contract term. And so when they go home, they now can actually take this information from this labor contract and use that as an economic identity to maybe get a bank account or to get a savings account, open up a credit card, get credit. So it's kind of like a backdoor to create an economic identity for these migrant workers through the recruitment agencies, because the recruitment agencies already have to do so much work to get these workers approved and screened to work in a foreign country. And I think a lot of other organizations are approaching this problem as, let's just try to get the migrant workers to start using some kind of digital solution. But we think that since they are already going to the recruitment agencies to get work, this is kind of like an easy backdoor to get them to use some platform that the recruitment agency says, hey, this is how you have to register on the system in order to get a contract to work in this foreign country. And so since all that information lives in the blockchain, we can use that information in the future to provide an identity to that person who may not have had an identity in the past.
Yeah, well, yeah, that sounds great. This all sounds really great, what you're doing. What are we looking at timeline-wise? When do you think you guys are gonna, actually have a product launched, or do you already? What's coming from you guys in the next month, 6 months, and 2 years?
Yeah. I mean, the hackathon ends next week, and we fully expect to have an MVP done by then. And we're talking to a couple of recruiters or like job agencies in Saudi Arabia that we plan to roll it out with next month.